We've made it, somehow, to the other side of the NHL Trade Deadline. Welcome back to Frankly Speaking, presented by Betway. If you're going to place a bet on Betway. 19 plus, please play responsibly. You know, I always think about the trade deadline like a fat guy going down the hill on a scooter with one wheel. I'm always just trying to make it to the finish line, and here we are. I feel like a human being again. And the days are getting longer, it's getting warmer. Playoff hockey beckons. But let's put a bow on the NHL trade deadline for 2025 by answering a few of your questions. No guest this week, just me and you, and your questions that came in on social media. We'll rip through them. I'll give you my answers, some fun, some frivolous, hopefully all entertaining and interesting. Let's start with Creaker, who fires a rocket right out of the box. Creaker712 says, Frank, do you style your hair with Baconator, grease, or Big Mac sauce? I mean, come on, man. Isn't the obvious answer mayo? Let's go. All right, Kerslake Al says, black eye on the Boston Bruins with the Brad Marchand giveaway. Lifelong hockey fan from 1965. I've seen the Gretzky deal, which turned the hockey world upside down. This treatment and ending for Brad ranks in the top 10 surprise deals in my lifetime. And you know, Al, it really was a tremendously entertaining and interesting trade deadline with what the drama played out in the final few hours. Mikko Rantanen, a top 15 player on the planet, he moves from Carolina to Dallas. And then in the final moments before the deadline, Brad Marchand on his way to the Florida Panthers, the captain, their heart, their soul. A lot of Bruins fans feeling the same way as Al. I don't necessarily come at it from that same perspective. And listening to Brad Marchand this week, I don't think he does either. They were far apart. They had a gap in negotiations, and business is business. Sometimes that works out where the two sides just don't see eye to eye on the future of direction of the team and business. And after trading Brandon Carlo, Trent Frederick, Justin Brazeau, and Charlie Coyle all in one fell swoop in deadline week, maybe the Bruins are just sitting there saying, does it really make sense to lock up this cap space and commit to our captain who turns 37 with a multi-year deal when we're clearly going to be retooling this team? The Bruins ripped the Band-Aid off, and in doing so, at the very least, I think they did Marchand a favor by sending him to the place that he wanted to go. I'd imagine that's why the deal took so long to put together, is because the Panthers ultimately had leverage. They knew that they were, if not the only team, one of the only teams that Marchand wanted to go to. And then they didn't really have to offer up a whole ton in order to make it happen. A conditional second-round pick that can become a first if and only if the Panthers win 2 rounds and Marchand plays in 50% or more of the games. So, did the Bruins really treat Marchand poorly by getting him to a competitor if they were going to get to a spot where he had already played his last game as a Boston Bruin anyway, given his injury? Maybe they just did right by him. We'll move on to Borderman8 in Alberta, who says, the biggest thing I've always wondered, there's obviously several, quote, insiders, but do you ever talk to each other on or off the record? I can't imagine you'd share scoops or anything, but are you guys friends outside of work? It is a small circle. There's maybe 5 of us total or 6. And yeah, for the most part, I'd say we get along. There's definitely a competitive edge that all of us have. I used to work with the guys at TSN. I'd call Chris Johnson one of my closest friends in the business. And yeah, I get that, you know, you don't want to share too much, but at the same time, I'll tell you this, there's probably a good chance that all of us can guess where we're all getting our information from when we see a scoop. That we generally have a pretty good sense of how each other works, whether you're at one network or the other. And we've all been around long enough, living in a small enough circle to know that everyone talks. This is from Lynn Crowley, who says, what goalie do the Edmonton Oilers go after in the offseason? Do you think they can pry Saros away from Nashville? I don't know that you'd want UC Saros with that contract, that commitment, and especially some of the warts that we've seen in his game. I was wondering if the Four Nations Faceoff for Saros would help put him back on the map in terms of the goalie echelon, but I think back to their short playoff run last season in Nashville and some really underwhelming numbers and think that that's a contract that the Preds probably regret at this point. You know, it's going to be interesting because you are going to have to pay Skinner as well moving forward. That when you consider the commitment to Skinner, Bouchard, and certainly some others that the Edmonton Oilers are going to have to pay, starting with their captain and Connor McDavid, that you're going to run out of money at some point. And it's going to depend also not just on what Skinner's looking for, but what is the rest of the market available? And can you get your hands on a value piece if you're the Oilers that might help increase your save percentage in net? They've definitely missed out on some timely stops this season, and the up and down nature of Skinner's game, I think you can directly correlate to the Edmonton Oilers' rise and fall in the standings. When he's on, they look nearly unbeatable, and when he's off, they look about just like any other team. This is from Bench Rates, who wants to know, the Canes were going to add a middle six forward, but they spent too much time on Rantanen's trade and didn't have enough time to do another deal. What player were they trying to acquire? I believe, contrary to reports, that the Canes had spent some time in the last hour between 2 and 3 p.m. focused on a defenseman. I don't know exactly who that was. That's what I was told. Any reports out there that suggested that they offered a first-round pick at the last minute for Brock Besser, I think is inaccurate. I believe that the Canes and Canucks did not have a single conversation about Brock Besser. And beyond that, look, I think the Canes are pretty well situated up front. And getting Logan Stankoven from the Dallas Stars really helped. They feel like he's a good fit for the style of play that they want under Rod Brind'Amour. And I do think one of the big mistakes, if you can call it that, throughout this entire process for the Canes, I'm not going to fault them at all for taking a swing on Mikko Rantanen, but it was that they didn't set a proper deadline earlier in the day to get the deal done, so that if they wanted to get that filed to central registry and then be in a spot where they could use the assets or the cap space that they had, because essentially the way it worked out, that Rantanen deal with the contract extension didn't get filed until just before the deadline, at which point it gets placed in the queue. And it was well after 5 Eastern. The deadline was at 3 that they started officially processing that trade. So the Canes couldn't use the cap space. They couldn't use any of the picks that they got to flip. And maybe in the end, that ends up saving them. Who knows? I don't know what else they had on the table, but perhaps if they said, hey, look, this trade call needs to be in with the league and central registry by 12 noon Eastern, giving us 3 extra hours to get something else done, then maybe that was the best way to approach it. But the Dallas Stars were insistent that they were not submitting that deal and trading Logan Stankoven unless there was an extension filed at the same time. And that's fine, but sometimes you got to do that on a handshake too and take the Rantanen camp and the Stars at their word. Hockey Barn _ wants to know, what was your screen time? Hockey Barn review. What was your screen time on deadline day? I did look at my phone. It was 16 hours and 10 minutes, which sounds like a lot, but a huge chunk of that came in the morning, by the way. I drove back from doing the Amazon Coast to Coast show, got back home around 2 a.m., and I was actually still on the phone calling and talking to NHL GMs into the 3 o'clock hour who were also just exhausted. I think everyone was a zombie by that point. My first hit the next morning was at 6 a.m., and then obviously on the phone all day, which 16 hours and 10 minutes, I guess, is kind of impressive in the sense that the deadline was also at 3. So just a few hits and calls to make after that, and pretty much wanted to throw my phone in a river at that point. SoCal Avs fan wants to know, Frank, what was going on here? And they linked to a tweet from January 24th, the night that the Mikko Rantanen trade went down. And I wrote at the time, not sure how to process yet, but impeccable source said that this Rantanen deal was not the biggest thing on the table in the last 48 hours. What I was alluding to at the time and couldn't say publicly was that the Carolina Hurricanes had called and inquired about Mitch Marner that week before pulling off the deal for Mikko Rantanen. Obviously, the same ask came this time around for the Canes from Toronto to send them Mikko Rantanen. It would have been a straight up swap, but in the end, Mitch Marner wasn't willing to waive his no trade clause, and I don't have any evidence yet that the Toronto Maple Leafs asked Mitch Marner to waive also in January when he retained the full no move. This is from the prospect Don, who goes by the handle Ice Level Intel. Were the Blackhawks really not offered more than a third for Ryan Donato? I think they had a second round pick on the table, but I think what they were wrestling with all day was the idea that Ryan Donato has been a big part of their team. He's exceeded expectations in terms of goal scoring production. He's versatile. He competes. He's really found another level to his game by changing the mechanics of his skating, which is something that the Blackhawks have talked about a few different times this season. And they didn't get an extension done with him, but I think they put a 3-year deal on the table south of $4 million that would have made him, I think, probably pretty comfortable. The big question for Donato, who I think handled everything perfectly after the deadline had passed and he remained a Hawk, saying that he was blessed to be there still and thankful for the opportunity. The big thing for him to dissect over the next few weeks is, do I take that offer or do I go to market? He's going to potentially touch 30 goals for the first time in his career. I don't know that that's necessarily a repeatable thing for Ryan Donato, but the Hawks are going to have to spend. And if you're going to spend and hand out money to teams, to players and free agents just to get to the floor, wouldn't you rather do it for a guy that you know fits really well and obviously works hard at the same time? I think that's probably pretty appealing to the Hawks. They were not dead set on trading him. I think someone else, Gumto2905, asked what was the asking price for Donato. They were asking for a first-round pick. I don't think that a trade ever got that close, and the Hawks were just fine with that. NHL Trade Alert wants to know any stories from NHL execs getting upset with you or breaking a trade or releasing any news early. Not really that I can recall, except for the expansion draft with the Seattle Kraken. That's the only time I've ever gotten a message from a league executive basically asking very politely, we understand you have a job to do, but could you potentially chill out, essentially slow your roll, stop. We have a show tonight with a live reveal of this roster and you are gutting it, was more or less what was said. And in respect, if you go back and watch my timeline from that day, I did pull back. And yeah, a lot of the team was out there at that point, but no one has ever really gotten on me. It just comes down to, accountability, treating people like you'd want to be treated, being accurate. Look, sometimes there's a lot of stuff flying around. There's a lot to sift through, and I'd much rather, from my point of view, be second and be right as opposed to being first and wrong. So that's all that matters, is trying to keep that batting average as close to 1,000 as possible. And not perfect. Even just going back to the night of the Rantanen trade on January 24th, I broke the trade, Mikko Rantanen going from Colorado to Carolina, and then got one piece of it wrong in the process in saying that Jesperi Kotkaniemi was part of the trade. It was not. It was Jack Drury. But nonetheless, sometimes you don't get it 100% correct, and that's, to me, the part that's inexcusable. I'm still mad at myself for that. Let's see. Herm Johnson wants to know, what is the best case scenario for the Utah Hockey Club this offseason in regards to free agency? Look, I've said this many times, I don't think there's a team in the NHL that's better prepared for the future and the present than Utah. They are knocking on the door of the playoffs this year. They are a team that has star power up front. They've got a proven Stanley Cup winner on the back end, a horse in Mikhail Sergachev, and they just locked up their goalie Karel Vejmelka to a very reasonable deal that mirrors the Kevin Lankinen deal in Vancouver. They've got picks. They've got so many prospects. They cannot possibly sign them all, which is why look at that trade of Shea Weber, his contract, who's already in the Hall of Fame, to the Chicago Blackhawks. That helps the Hawks in the sense that they do not have to spend. That LTIR money can go toward some of their gap that they'd have to bridge to get to the salary cap floor. And it helps Utah in a big way that they don't have to operate in LTIR. They can get that off their books. Pretty significant. But they traded a few prospects in order to do it. I don't know that they're game changers, but guys that Utah cannot possibly keep. They can't keep all these guys. Teams have been calling and asking about their prospects. And the tough part for Bill Armstrong is going to be, are we signing the right guys or the wrong guys? And you better get it right. So that's part of their process as well that they're going to have to hone in on, and probably have been for months. But Utah is going to be a player. They've got cap space, players and teams that have gone through Salt Lake City this year. I've been very impressed with the environment. they're going places. I guarantee you that. NHL Big Red wants to know, I need someone to explain to me how the Red Wings didn't at least add a bottom pair defenseman. Justin Hall and Eric Gustafsson together are not an NHL pair. Gus could be passable with a decent partner, but that partner is not Hall. Could not agree with you more, Big Red. I've said the Red Wings were one of the biggest disappointments of the deadline, not doing more to support that team and not helping their team defensively on the back end. That's the biggest hole in Steve Yzerman's game since he's been back with the Detroit Red Wings is talent evaluation on the back end. You've got it nailed on the amateur side. Simon Edvinsson and that pair, fantastic. You've got players coming. They're on the way. But the pro scouting side, the players that they've signed, traded for, and let's have a big reminder, the Jake Wallman trade, players that you've moved away from, even Shane Gostisbehere goes somewhere else. He's much better. Every time it seems like they've made the wrong move, trading for Jeff Petrie, whatever it might be, they've picked the wrong guys and they cannot get it right. And the fact that they didn't help better support that team who had been on a tear for a while from Boxing Day when Todd McClellan was hired well into late February, it just felt like the sag that's come after and around the trade deadline now at this juncture recording this have lost 6 straight. The wind is out of their sails and it's their defense that's going to keep them out of the playoffs. They already had the missing pieces up front, the nice trade deadline ads. They got those in Patrick Kane and Vladimir Tarasenko. They had them from the beginning of the season. They didn't have the proper defenseman in place. NHL Trade Alert wants to know, what does the day of an NHL Insider look like? I think he means on trade deadline day. Besides being busier, is it different? Is it any different earlier in the season compared to as you get closer to the trade deadline? So it is like the NHL season is very cyclical. Like for the first, few months, everyone's trying to get their feet wet, hot starts, training camp previews, wrapping your brain around the rosters and the transactions that were made over the summer. You've got a ton of shows and pods to prep for the season. Then you settle into the season. You're checking the standings around trade deadline time. You've got the roster freeze, our first trade targets board of the year. And then really, I use the holiday break to gear up for the deadline. I've got a plan in place, a list of stories that I want to accomplish. And essentially once January 2nd hits on the other side of the Winter Classic, it's go time. It's full trade deadline mode. So believe it or not, trade deadline day itself is not incredibly stressful. It's a long day because it's a long show. You're 5 hours consecutively on air with the team at Daily Faceoff. But you've done the prep work. You've done the homework. You're fully prepared. You've been doing your trade targets board, updating with names. You've been keeping in touch with contact sources around the league to understand what the field looks like. And there's always surprises. There's always something that pops that you didn't see coming. The Norris trade for Dylan Cousins between the Sens and Sabres. Like, you're not prepping for that. But we did have Dylan Cousins on our trade board. I just didn't expect that he'd be swapped to the Sens for Josh Norris. So things definitely materialize. You have to be able to read and react, but deadline day itself, there's also a finality to it. Like once you get through all the trades in the queue, you just you sit back and you try and digest it all, hopefully over a beer, a very cold beer. And I would say, if we're ranking beers, by the way, what's like your all-time favorite beer? Is it an airport beer? Is it a beach beer? Is it a beer in the locker room after a men's league game? All of those beers all taste pretty good, but I got to tell you, for me, post-trade deadline, it's in the top 5. And if I had to pick, I'd go with a Miller High Life. Ty James wants to know, trade deadline aside, you're the person who breaks a trade. How does that start? Do you reach out to your sources constantly trying to gauge potential activity? Do sources reach out to you? Does someone give you a tip to chase? So the answer to all those questions is yes. I am constantly reaching out to people, and people ask me all the time, why do NHL GMs talk to you? And the answer is hopefully because it's mutually beneficial. I'm in touch with a lot of their counterparts, agents, players, team presidents, CEOs, league executives, union executives. So I'm talking to everyone and fielding information. And then in the best case scenario, I'm sharing that information when appropriate to help provide them insight or shed light on something that they otherwise might not be able to from a team that's a rival or a division team, or even just what some other manager might be thinking that then I kind of take all that information in and process it and then decide whether or not to even share any of that. There is certainly some pressure and power in that, because I'd say, and I've mentioned this before on another Q&A, I think the best insider in the world, the best to ever do it, Bob McKenzie, he would say that really a top insider is sharing maybe 10% of what he actually knows. And you see other guys, and I'm not going to name them, but you see other guys that are pretenders that want to be in the insider game, that every little tidbit that they get, you see it on social media. You see a tweet. And first off, from a business sense, like, I'm not even sure how you would monetize that other than your claim to be in the game or in the know. And second, I don't know what good it does you to do a lot of the play-by-play. Like, if you watch my timeline and feed throughout deadline week and leading up to it, I don't give a ton of play-by-play because, one, it changes, and what's true now isn't necessarily true a minute from now. And not only that, but I think it just damages the process. Unless you know that something's happening and you're hinting at it, which does happen from time to time because you can't fully get it across the goal line and confirmed, but unless you're foreshadowing something big that's in the works, you might just be gumming up the process, which no one really wants either. And that's, again, how you get people upset with you or in the crosshairs. So the answer to all those things is yes. And you'd be shocked, Ty, where some of these tips come from. I don't know, like, they come from the wackiest places at times. So-and-so's girlfriend said to so-and-so, and then a player texts me, and then boom, 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 down the line. I'm never too proud to chase any little thing that I hear. The worst thing that someone says to you is, no, that's not accurate. And then I can just go back to about my life. Another Tyler Cavalieri says, my question is, how could you say that the New York Rangers had deep conversations about JJ Peterka? New York Rangers beat reporter reported that said they didn't, and it comes out that Buffalo had no intentions of trading him. First off, I said in the beginning that the Buffalo Sabres had no intentions of trading him when I put him on my trade targets board. I knew that the conversation around JJ Peterka probably included a 10% likelihood that he would end up being traded. However, there was a few reasons for that. One, there have been a few malcontents in Buffalo that are unhappy with their current situation that would like a change of scenery. And I think Peterka falls in that category, whether or not he's made a formal trade request or not. And so you're saying, well, hey, the Buffalo Sabres, why would they trade a first-line left winger or first-line winger that they have that's been so productive, that's age 23? Shouldn't they just pack in their franchise? He's got leverage at some point. He's a pending RFA. He needs to sign a new contract. So they can make him a qualifying offer. They can make him a long-term offer. My question is, will he sign it? And if not, and he signs an offer sheet, then what? What are the Sabres going to do then? That's a little hint and a picture for moving forward. Not to say they're definitely going to get an offer sheet, but that he may find his way out whether the Sabres want him to or not, and it might have been wise for them to consider a better alternative now. That's going to be a great storyline to watch as we get into May and June and the Sabres begin to pick through the rubble of what is yet another really disappointing season. When it comes to the Rangers portion of it, I know that the New York Rangers were one of 2 or 3 teams to put a bona fide, legitimate offer on the table. I think the Rangers offered up a roster player and a first-round pick, and we'll see what else was part of that deal. I also don't know who the roster player was. So feel very confident in saying that. And look, not doubting the Rangers beat reporter and his sources that reported that they weren't in on Peterka, but there's another reporter in Buffalo, Lance Lysowski, saying the same thing. There was Renaud Lavoie from TVA Sports in Quebec saying the same thing about Peterka. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Kai Mueller in Ontario says, now that the trade deadline's passed, how do you see the Flames' approach of shaping their future? Do you think Conroy did enough to set the team up for success? Or are we possibly going to see moves this offseason? I'd think that with the play of Dustin Wolf, they're going to have to expedite this timeline a little bit. If the Calgary Flames make the playoffs this year, Dustin Wolf will be receiving the #1 vote on my Calder Trophy ballot, because the few goals that team has scored, the fact that they are in striking distance of the playoffs is crazy enough as it is, but it also speaks to a guy that's come into his own. They've let this develop and progress the right way. 2-time AHL MVP. Like, he's been unbelievable at every turn, and he's been ready and set for this level for a while. Now he's gone and done it. So if the Flames, let's just call them the 16th place team if they make the playoffs this year. How do they find a way to go from 16th to 14th to 12th to 10th and continue to improve and improve? The bands of what that team might be, whether it's 14th to 20th or 12th to 18th, whatever it is, a reasonable expectation, you've got to change that now because Dustin Wolf is playing at that such an elite level. They tried to support this team a bit with the Frost and Farabee acquisitions. I would argue for a very low price to take a swing like that. But what other players can Calgary find on the market this summer that fit their age game? They were one of the teams calling about Dylan Cousins. I wouldn't be shocked to see if they were calling about JJ Peterka. Other teams that are out there that are in that mix that want to shake things up and move things around, the Flames could be a pretty big beneficiary of that, and they've got lots of picks and prospects to be able to do it. Flo in Australia wants to know, how did Rakell not get traded? Dubas wants to keep him or just holding out for a different offer? I'm told that the Pittsburgh Penguins were looking for a, quote, king's ransom in order to move on from Rickard Rakell. Only time will tell whether that was short-sighted in their approach or not. He's got 3 years left at $5 million a year. He's having potentially a career goal-scoring year, just at 30 goals now, and could potentially end up with a career high. Given that his value was extremely low and the deal was untradeable just a short time ago, this time last year, should the Pittsburgh Penguins have capitalized? And I'm told that they had presented to teams basically a blanket ask. It was your top prospect plus 2 first-round picks in order to get Rickard Rakell. And more or less, the Pittsburgh Penguins said to those teams, unless you're willing to talk in those types of terms, don't bother engaging with us or calling on Rickard Rakell. That's what we're looking for. We'll see how that plays out. Does he get back to that same level next year and help that team that's desperately looking for relevance to help support Sidney Crosby and that core in the absolute twilight of their careers? Lieutenant Dan has a very simple question. Where do sources come from? Man, I could spend a while talking about that, but let's just say anywhere. Some are at the very top of the organization, like I just mentioned. GM, president, CEO, head coach, but they're everywhere. They're all over the place. It's anyone that's armed with information that is willing to talk to you and share, and a mutual trust exists if that's the case. My friend Jeremiah Maxwell in Alaska, also known as Beard_Sports, asks, Frank, are you surprised the Red Wings didn't make a move for a goaltender like Gibson? No, Jeremiah, I think I'm more surprised, going back to the other question in our conversation here, that they didn't go out and get a defenseman. They did get Peter Mrazek, which I think is a nice little lift, but man, between defense and goaltending, it's been very disappointing at those positions. Someone like a Sebastian Cossa cannot get there soon enough for the Red Wings. And I just never had John Gibson on my trade targets board once this entire process. I know he was talked about a lot. I didn't see any goalie market, period. And beyond that, I certainly didn't see one for a team that wanted legitimate assets back for Gibson, who had rebounded in a big way this season with much better numbers, but still carries a contract with a cap hit that is not very comfortable. Now, that can change with the cap going up and Gibson coming off of a better year. And in addition to that, the annual game of goaltending musical chairs. Will someone step up to get Gibson? I think the conversation is different in the summer than it was at this deadline, while a lot of teams were still cap strapped. Tom, who's also known as playoff_T, says, what would happen if a team has retention on a player, reacquires that player later, and after the no trade period passes? For example, if the Flyers reacquired Kevin Hayes, would the retention spot reopen? The answer to that, Tom, is no. Teams that have retained on a player, I do not believe can be reacquired by that same team for a period of time. That also involves, it's a complicated thing, but I believe that's the answer to your question, Tom. Puckman YEG says, were the Oilers in on Brandon Carlo? Did they value Jake Wallman more than him? How often do you get info that's incorrect? What has been your biggest insider regret? Wow, that's a lot to unpack. Biggest insider regret. I'll tell you, this is a real simple one. The night that I broke the Mikko Rantanen trade on January 24th, from Colorado to Carolina, I mentioned earlier how I messed up one of the pieces getting traded in the deal. So I said, Jesperi Kotkaniemi was going from Carolina to Colorado, and that didn't happen. And again, that was confirmed by multiple people. I don't really feel comfortable, unless I'm hearing it directly from the source who's involved in making the deal, running with it. That got a 3-series stamp of approval, and I still got it wrong. But in a rush or in a moment to correct myself, I deleted the Kotkaniemi tweet, but I accidentally also hit delete on the tweet that was the breaking news scoop, which already had 2 million views at that point. So gone from my timeline, never to come back. That's my biggest insider regret. Not that it matters. But how often do I get info that's incorrect? Pretty frequently, which is why you chase those things down and ask the questions. Were the Oilers in on Brandon Carlo? Yes, they were. I think if possible, his preference was to try and remain in the US, but I don't know that held too much sway. And with Jake Wallman in the end, I think they valued similarly the term that he had, but there was also a stylistic fit that they felt like Wallman had some more offensive upside that Carlo didn't have. And the tough part about Wallman was getting the deal over the finish line, because they had gone back and forth for so long and asked repeatedly, I'm told, to Mike Grier and the Sharks, can you trade Wallman? Can you trade Wallman? And the answer every time was no, until suddenly they just put an offer on the table on Thursday before deadline day. And it made Mike Grier think twice before pulling the trigger and ultimately moving Jake Wallman. Great deal for Mike Grier, by the way. I think Mike Grier low-key has had one of the best calendar years of any NHL GM. Just the asset management alone, the salary dump of Mikael Granlund, getting a first-round pick for him, getting a second-round pick to take on Jake Wallman, and then trading him for a first from Edmonton. Chef's kiss, Mike Grier. And the vibes are high in San Jose. You look at the Hawks in 31st place, the San Jose Sharks in 32nd. You'd never know it by the way that they play and the energy that they have. So they've got a good thing going. Kevin Beckendam says, Devils GM Tom Fitzgerald said the Devils were second, aka outbid. Any idea on who and what were they bidding on? My guess would be Brock Nelson from the New York Islanders going to the Colorado Avalanche. Just a guess. I know that they were looking for a center, not just with Jack Hughes being out, but also as an upgrade down the middle on potentially Eric Halla or whoever it might be. And look, the New York Islanders had told teams that were inquiring, one, they weren't sure that Brock Nelson would be willing to waive his no trade to go to Canada. But two, that was a moot point because, well, the Islanders told teams, Lou Lamoriello said, you're not going to beat what I have on the table. And as one GM said after the fact, getting Cal Ritchie in a first, boy, he was not kidding. Great deal for the Islanders. Bill Kessel 3 says, what do you think Winnipeg offered for Brock Nelson? Tied into the same last answer. I don't think it got very far, although they were very interested. They were ready, willing, and waiting to put something pretty significant on the table, but no one really has the prospect of the quality of Cal Ritchie that ended up being moved. I think a can't-miss future NHL player, one of the smartest, most adaptable players. Check out our guy Stephen Ellis on dailyfaceoff.com because he's had the goods on Cal Ritchie and a guy that I'm a big believer in. I can tell you there were so many teams around the league that were really disappointed that they couldn't get their hands on Cal Ritchie because they had been calling and asking, and he just wasn't moving. Thrillium13 asks, when trade calls are, quote, in the queue, are those public knowledge? Can other GMs see what's pending? I believe the answer to that is no. But if we're any good at our jobs as insiders, we get that information out once it's filed to the league and in the queue. And I'll wrap up with Kenny M18 from South Bay, California, who asks, Utah cleared up over $7 million in cap space by trading Shea Weber. What are they planning for? They're planning for everything. They're going to take a run at I would believe a big name free agent, offer sheets, whatever it might be. I would have had Mikko Rantanen on their list. I would still have Mitch Marner on their list. I'd imagine they'll be one of the bidders. And I guess that's kind of what makes it fun and also gives me anxiety as we release this latest, frankly speaking, Q&A episode. We're just over 100 days until NHL free agency on July 1st. Just give me a few weeks to feel like a human being again as we get closer to the playoff chase. I've got GM meetings next week. Then we'll take a couple weeks before the Stanley Cup playoffs begin, and we'll be in off-season mode for half the league by then. Giddy up. That'll do it for this week's edition of Frankly Speaking. Thanks so much for your questions. Really appreciate everyone following along all season long, and particularly for our record-setting trade deadline coverage. You guys have been fantastic, not just on the YouTube, but wherever you download and listen to our podcasts and shows. Deeply appreciative here at Daily Faceoff. That's Frankly Speaking, and it's presented by Betway. If you're going to place a bet, bet on Betway. 19 plus, please play responsibly.
What's up, hockey fans? If you enjoyed that video, then you need to be hitting the subscribe button right here at Daily Faceoff. Exclusive interviews and analysis from our hockey insider Frank Seravalli, fantasy updates from Brock Sagan, and a daily live show at noon Eastern, Monday through Friday. You don't want to miss any of the fantastic content, so hit that subscribe button.